Okay, we're good.
For thousands of years, elders and knowledge keepers have used stories to educate future generations. Stories and words can help heal our hearts and make Mother Earth a better place for all people. This is Healing Hearts.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Healing Hearts. I'm Tracy Koga. Have you ever felt like you were the only one that looked different at the table, or maybe at the party? Or have you been on a committee where there have been very, very few representations of the minority groups? Well, tonight we're going to be talking about tokenism, and more importantly, the impact that it has on Indigenous and newcomer communities today. This is Healing Hearts.
So the Hive is a climbing and fitness facility, so we're bouldering only, which means no ropes or harnesses. We use mats for protection. The 4 pillars of our business are climbing, education, health and wellness, and community, and those aspects all kind of come together to create like a 5-star climbing experience.
We are very, very thankful to the Hive for being a great sponsor for Healing Hearts. And I want to welcome all of our guests on tonight's show. So welcome to Ian Ross. It's so good to see you, Ian. It has been a long while and miss your incredible plays, but I'm sure you've been writing lots in this period that we've had sort of off. Looking forward, though, to hearing all about your thoughts and comments on today's subject, as well as we have a very special guest, Darasimi Olboy, all the way from Thompson, Manitoba. And thank you so much, Darasimi, for joining us, because you're going to bring a very special, I think, perspective to what we're going to be talking about, which is tokenism. And of course, a warm welcome to Kate Kaler and to Hani Atan Alubiri. So good to see both of you. And again, a big thank you to Kate and Hani also for your tremendous support for this show. I guess I'm feeling a little sentimental. This is our second to last show, but it has been a whirlwind, a roller coaster of incredible conversations, and it's for me something that I will take away forever. And I hope tonight everybody here and all of our viewers can learn something more, because each and every one of you, I know, are going to have your own opinions about this. So we're going to start with our special guest, Darasimi. Okay, a little sidebar information for Ian, Kate, and Hani. This young lady was part of a debate, part of Black History Month, which was all, of course, in the month of February, and the subject was tokenism. And so, Darasimi, okay, so give us, I guess, a recap of how the debate went, who was involved, and more importantly, the pros and cons. How did they weigh?
Hi, thanks for having me here. So basically, to let people know, tokenism is basically when there is only a drop of something, and in this context, like one person that's different and then everybody else the same. And for our debate, it went really good. Well, we had a slight setback because both teams were accidentally working towards the same argument, even though we should have had opposite sides for them. But we regrouped and we managed to fix it, and it was a success. Now, for some of the arguments for the pros of tokenism is tokenism opens the door for minority groups to kind of get in the spotlight. But then the opposite, like the counter idea against that was that, like, yes, it does open a door, but then sometimes it's not the appropriate door. Mm-hmm. And then the other argument supporting tokenism was that tokenism lets people of color and other minorities kind of like when they see someone that looks like them, it makes others try harder and know that, oh, I can do this because so and so is doing this. This seems something like I can achieve because that person is also doing it. But then the thing against that was that like we shouldn't base what we want on people, and then that tokenism could lead into negative stereotypes. So those were kind of the main topics that we talked about.
For you yourself personally, Darasimi, what was your takeaway from the debate?
My takeaway was that I think tokenism, I was kind of in the middle because, yeah, there are some good parts and there are some bad parts. Like, for example, if we didn't have, like, for example, if you had a movie and there was no person of color and it was just all a specific group of people, then if someone wanted to go in and be part of the movie, it'd be tokenism because they would be the only one standing there. But then other people would also be like, oh, they made it in. I also want to be in there. I think tokenism is both a positive and a negative thing because in the disadvantages, it provides negative stereotypes. And a lot of times what we see is what we think, and what we see also kind of like goes into our biases without ours, like into our implicit biases without us realizing what's happening. Like for example, if you watch different movies and if you notice that a certain group of people are portrayed a certain way, you're gonna think that those people are that way, even though they're like people aren't monoliths. There's a whole world of different people around, but it wouldn't be on purpose. But like without you knowing, you'd assume that that group of people acts that way. But then the positive thing, like the reason I agree for tokenism is tokenism opens the door for people, not just the community that's not included, but also for like the general community that's already in there. It's kind of like teach them and help them and just to like learn about different cultures and other people and diverse groups.
Wow. I want to come back to you a little bit later, Darasimi, and hear your, I guess, opinions and what it's in life growing up in Thompson for you too as well, because I'm sure you have a different perspective than us city folks. But Ian, okay, so this young lady, Darasimi, has said a little bit about tokenism. I'm so happy that you joined us to give us your, I guess, opinion about tokenism. Tokenism in the arts. You're a playwright. Yes. You might be muted, Ian.
There we go. Wouldn't be a Zoom call without someone being muted and talking, right? I echo what some of what Darcini says, in that being a little bit older, I kind of have experienced some of it firsthand, right? So what would happen a lot of the times in terms of theater companies across Canada was, let's say I had a play and I would pitch the play to a company in Saskatchewan. And I'd say, please produce my play. This is what it's about. And the response I would often get was, oh, we already did an Indigenous play last year. So there was this challenge, and I feel like this is the real issue with tokenism, is that there was a feeling that it was doing just enough. That's all you had to do, was just enough. It's a bit like reconciliation, with what's going on with Indigenous people in the rest of Canada. You'll often hear Indigenous people say that they're a bit tired of it because they feel like they're the ones who have to do all the reconciling. We're the ones who have to do all the hard work, when in fact it lays on the other side. And that perception is like, it's prevalent, it's everywhere. I worked with the Treaty Relations Commission, and the director at the time, Dennis Whitebird, he told the story of how he was coming back from the airport, and they had just started this brand new ad campaign, and it was with, I believe it was him in regalia and a headdress that you would see a chief wearing, and they were using prominent Manitobans to get the message across that we are all treaty people, that the treaties allowed for expansion, but also like peaceful coexistence. Now, of course, they weren't honored, and that's a whole other story. But the message they were getting across was that everyone in Manitoba is a treaty person. And so, as he was driving from the airport in a cab, the ad for that was on the side of a bus, and it was a picture of Chief Dennis Whitebird, and it was Fred Penner, and they were holding hands, like shaking hands and smiling. And the cab driver looked over and he said, "Oh, I didn't know that Fred Penner was Aboriginal." Right. So again, like the perception that even that message is so hard to get across that it, I think ultimately it can be more damaging if, as I said, that's all that's done. But I do see positive changes happening in Canada right now. I think there's a lot of things happening. And further to what Darasani said, like I just read about it yesterday. There's something called the Scully effect. I don't know if you guys have heard of this, but when the X-Files was this huge hit in the 90s on television, it seems to have encouraged a number of women to go into the sciences, investigative careers, like all of these things that traditionally women didn't go into. They saw the numbers all start to rise, and they attribute it to seeing that one female character who was essentially an investigative scientist. She was a police officer, right? Like, or so there can be positive that comes out of it, but again, that's just my concern, is that it's one of perception and that feeling of that, we're just doing the bare minimum rather than embracing it, right? So,
Ian, if we kind of look at the arts as a whole, how have they kind of expanded? Because I mean, I can kind of take it from my dance experience, or too as well. And yes, I guess now when I think of it, yes, tokenism was definitely there.
yeah. Well, in some ways, I think societally, this isn't bragging. I would say that the arts, artistic practice, artists themselves, we're kind of the tip of the spear. We're showing what's happening in society, where things are going. Mm-hmm. Often you'll find that arts and artists embrace concepts and peoples in ways that other people are not quite maybe there. Like, just as an example, when I was a young man in theater, you would find there were a number of people there who were part of the LGBTQ community, which it wasn't called that back then. It was just sort of like, you're gay or you're trans or whatever. But there was an acceptance of that in theater. And I'm seeing there's still struggles there, but I'm seeing that becoming more broadly accepted within Canadian society, which I think is a good thing. So you see that element happening. But as far as like myself, again, it was a bit odd because there was a sensitivity to wanting to do the right thing. When I had my first big professional production, I was actually given a little bit too much power as a playwright, because they didn't have very many Indigenous playwrights at the time. And they didn't have a number of people that they could consult about, is this culturally appropriate? Is this sensitive to Indigenous people? So they turned to me because I was kind of the only one there. So I had a lot of say over my production, which a lot of playwrights don't get. So it kind of worked to my advantage in that way. But I can also tell you other kind of, which I won't go into, but kind of horror stories of artists who in other artistic fields were not treated very well, men were disrespected, so it's a challenge still even today, right? However, I do think that there's a different level of awareness, with what we're seeing around Every Child Matters and Black Lives Matter, and that there has been a shift in, I would say, perception in a better way. And I make the argument that a lot of the stuff you see happening in a broader sense in society, like the rise of these conservative right-wing groups and whatnot, that comes from what I see as the end of that kind of era. Because I'll just be honest, like this was said to me a few years ago. This was from a man who was from Holland, and he said, the truth of the matter is demographics don't lie. And he said, when you look at people of color, or in Manitoba, Indigenous people, he said, you're going to outbaby us because there's just going to be more brown people. And that's what I see happening in the world, right? And especially in Canada and North America. So change is happening and we're right in the middle of it in all kinds of ways. So I think it's actually an exciting time. It's an exciting time to be alive.
Wow. Again, maybe there's a play in that. So,
You could write it. You could write it.
Okay, yes, and we have to combine the X-Files and Scully and and all of that. Oh, anyways, Kate, let's go to you now. You mentioned that you could bring a settler's perspective, so that piqued my interest.
Well, settler's perspective, I guess, would be like the key word for it. But I guess maybe to situate a little bit of how I see myself in the conversation is that Social Planning Council is an organization with over 100 years experience, but it came out of the 1919 strike. But we always say that we weren't the strike breakers, but neither we were the strike leaders. It very much the people who founded what became the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg were very much of that upper middle class, looking to that charitable sort of approach as opposed to a social justice approach. So decades passed, we moved a little bit more into social justice. But what was interesting, what I always found interesting about the history of the organization is in 90 or 91, a group of concerned Winnipeggers got together and sold over 1,000 memberships in the organization because to overthrow the board at the time, because the board had lost touch, from the community. The community was like, you're just sitting there in your ivory tower doing research. Like, what are you talking about? You have no connection with what's going on the ground, especially around Indigenous issues. And so, as a minor example of how things can move forward is like, that's what led to a bylaw change that said, actually, within our board of directors, we have to have a minimum of 3 Indigenous boards of directors, not one. We didn't say, like that time, they didn't say just one, but they said minimum of 3 out of 15, recognizing the idea that there are any number of other issues that are going on, and we want to make sure that those voices are heard. So I guess, to me, that was a progressive idea. I wasn't around at the time. I'm not taking credit. I didn't live in Winnipeg at the time. It wasn't anything to do with it, but it was the idea that it was like they were saying, yeah, we can't just put one person in here and say, they're done, checked our box. So it was, and so, we've tried to honor that going forward. We've tried to honor that as far as when the idea of forming the Immigration Partnership Winnipeg came around, which we host. It is, my predecessor, so claiming no credit, approached Abdi Ahmed to take over the lead of it, to get this started. But right from the get-go, from those two, the conversation was not about, okay, it's all going to be about newcomers. It's like the number one issue that was prioritized was, how are we going to build better relationships between newcomers and Indigenous communities? Like that was key. And so part of that original steering committee was developed in that way. So the idea is that I find it really interesting, this idea that, just like affirmative action in the United States has pros, it also has cons. Right. And to acknowledge that. But I just found it really interesting from Darasimi's point of view and Ian's point of view is like, it can open a door But the negative side of it is that, again, I go, so previously to Social Planning Council, I was at the John Howard Society of Manitoba, and whenever I would talk about the impacts of structural racism, systemic racism, and poverty, and why people are get involved in crime, somebody will tell me, my grandfather moved to this country with $20 in his pocket and he never committed a crime and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, great. I'm sure they worked really hard, but guess what? The stars aligned for that person. And there were not barriers placed in that person's way, the way they are in others.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that, from my perspective, it's just the idea that it's just to be aware of, that you're not looking to just any sort of consultation, any sort of engagement. It has to be long term. You can't say, oh, I've got this great idea for a project and I want to run around. I'm going to talk to one person. I'm going to say, do you think this is a good idea? And if they say yes, great, I've got buy-in. That can't be what it is.
Right, no doubt. And I don't know, it's baffling in this day and age that we're still talking about a subject like this. And Hani, it's so good to see you, and welcome. And I know that, this show is your baby too as well. Tokenism, and I guess for you from a newcomer perspective as well.
Yeah, good evening. It's good to see Kate and you, Tracy, and nice to meet Darasimi and Anne. Anne, I heard about you, but I never met you, I think, in person or through Zoom. So I have mixed feelings when it comes to concepts like this, tokenism and all of that. I would be curious to bring the attention to the opposite of what tokenism is and start the conversation from there. If one was to establish an alternative positive spin on things. However, tokenism comes with a negative connotation when it's presented in any social setting, and it is a loaded term, and I think it's just a frustrated, that's how I look at it, is a frustrated impression of an attempt to diversity or inclusivity, and therefore tokenism exists, and I think it's a wrong path to inclusivity, and some other people may say the wrong path to diversity. So depending on who you talk to. And so if we were to talk about it on a global scale, then the conversation may take different path. If we talk about in a Canadian context or a Canadian example, then probably the conversation also travels different places. Me being a newcomer, all the successes or whatever you want to call it, the good work fruits that I'm harvesting now after many years of struggle, not necessarily due to racism or barriers of discrimination. It's just the fact life is difficult for a refugee or a former refugee. You have to voyage through many difficulties and you have to go through many hardships, but also the fact that I gained what I gained, it speaks volume to the fact that the society allowed some space for me to succeed. That needs to be captured as well. So I'm trying to be objective and talk about the impact of the absence of tokenism, and tokenism, as I said, it exists for a reason. It has a psychological, at least from, if I put my psychotherapist hat on and I will start talking about the reason behind tokenism to exist is really it is frustrated attempt, whether it's collective reaction on a societal level or it's individual frustrated reaction to something that the person or the society trying to repair, but they would not be able to delve deeper to go to the roots of that fixing attempt and deal with it in an authentic manner. And therefore, tokenism will serve us up. And so it is attempt. And I think, to be fair, I think the Canadian society, or we as a society, I think we're trying to make some We're pacing through the path of reconciliation or the path of connecting with one another. And yes, we're very slow on that path, but we are moving. I think there is a movement towards, I would say, forward, but it is not as fast as maybe we would like it to be, but we're moving. I think that's how I see it. I've been living in this city in particular for over 20 years. Trust me, there are many things happen over those 20 years. And we never had those conversations back then, 20 years, whether that was about diversity or inclusivity in this manner, or even tokenism or reconciliation. We did not have that. But now we have full conversation. But those conversations, if we leave them in the form of conversations, then we all collectively practicing tokenism. If we move them to action, then we're doing something. Now, we don't want to prejudge ourselves and be harsh on ourselves. And we say, well, maybe we're still chewing on the same words that we chewed on last year and the year before. I think we need to kind of also be cognizant to the fact that we need to give ourselves time to process all of the things that happen as a nation, because there are lots of files on huge issues, need some time. And I think we're doing our paces. We pace through it. We may pace through it slowly, but I feel, at least from my perspective, I think we're going somewhere, and I hope we're going somewhere positive. And I think we're doing what we could. I think we can do even better. But as I said, you look at it as a collective trauma. That's how I see it. Collective trauma would require some time for people to open up, be authentic. What kills the authenticity of any conversation or any attempt to get rid of tokenism is the political correctness and the attempt to make things look a little bit better so we please the listeners. Some listeners don't have the depth to understand all of the details, and that is okay because they are on a different path. But we need to be authentic and genuine with what we believe in and share it with our society, so our society can actually, it needs sometimes a little bit of a shake up so they can hear, oh, okay, this is a new details. It can shake up a little bit of my belief system. And it doesn't mean in a disrespectful manner, but in a creative way, to pause, reflect, and come up with the new ideas. But it seems to me when we run with the herd, just so we please one another, it becomes a problem. And that's in itself tokenism as well. So I'll stop here to give others a chance to talk.
Oh, Hani, you always put it so well. So, Darasimi, there's two things that Hani said that I want to ask you, and kind of spilling off of what Ian said, that, we are living in exciting times, and Darasimi's group is the future. First of all, I liked what Hani said. If we just have a conversation like this, like we are tonight, and it's all like, oh, yes, great, and it's a great conversation, and tomorrow you go on with your life, that's tokenism. But if we put our words into actions, whatever that may be, that is a step forward. Mm-hmm. So for you and, like-minded youth like yourself, what are some of the things that you would like to see done, or maybe you're already doing in your own community?
Something I would like to see is less of performative activism, if I could put it that way. Because just like the topic of tokenism, and just like Hani said earlier about only talking about it, but not actually doing something about it. And I have two examples for that. First would be like the Black Lives Matter movement. It was very big, but then it's died down a bit because people don't feel like they have to do something because it's not a lot of pressure anymore. Like they feel like the pressure isn't as much, so they don't really need to do a lot. And another example is for reconciliation, because I remember in grade 8, I think it was, or grade 7, I was participating in the Imagine a Canada project, and I submitted my project, and I think I did pretty good. But then like our teacher was teaching us about the different things that Canada promised for Indigenous people that were never met. And it was just something that like they kept saying over and over and over. Like a big example is like clean drinking water. Canada claims to have a lot of water. Like we here in Manitoba, or like we in the north, we have a lot of water. But then like how is it possible that some communities here in the north don't have clean water? And it's just something that the government have been saying for, I'm not sure how long it's been, but they've been saying for a long time, but it hasn't actually been talked about. And people talk about it, but no one's actually like making a plan, bringing up a plan, forming a group, or just like to be part of the movement. People want to be part of the movement, but they don't want to actually like do the work that the movement requires, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. And so, do you think that hopefully your generation might have the energy and the wherewithal to make
Well,
it happen?
it's a bit of a yes and no because yes, we're more educated. We're also more especially with the rise of social media, we can get ourselves educated at the tip of our fingers. But also makes it easier to think that like sharing, like reposting something is what like you've done good. Like an example for that would be like if there was like a video or a picture of a community that didn't have clean water, and then be like, oh, and then like someone said like, oh, this community doesn't have clean water, and then you repost them like, oh, I'm bringing awareness, this is like, and then thinking that that's good enough. But you should bring that conversation to like people in your family, your like your friends, just people around you, because that's how you actually start the movement, by talking about it with other people, by seeing what they think about it, by even talking about solutions that could happen, not just performative activism, because it's really really easy. Like it's way easier now because you can just post something and think that that's all you need to do.
Interesting. Ian, your thoughts on, another thing that Hani said, like we all like to live in a herd and all stay together. How do we kind of, maybe break away from the herd and maybe start a movement like Darasimi said? Or is it too late?
Oh yeah, you can go.
No, if you were going to talk, go ahead.
Okay, I was gonna say, I don't think it's too late, but we just need more people to realize. Because like I learned, because I took psychology last semester, and the thing is, when one person, no, like when something bad is happening, and people are gonna think, so okay, I'm gonna make it easier to understand. Let's assume that someone's getting robbed, right? In open daylight. It's 1 o'clock, someone's getting robbed. There's a lot of people around them, but no one's helping because everyone thinks that someone else can do it. I don't remember the term. I don't remember the term it was anymore, but thinking that other people could help solve the problem instead of you going to help the person that's getting robbed. Because I could be on the ship like, oh, someone's closer, they'll help them. Or like, oh wait, that person looks like a police officer, they'll help them. Or like, oh, that person's looks like they're stronger, they can help them. Instead of you kind of like making it your duty to see if the person's okay. To get, even if you can't do something, to get help, like call 911 or like find help somewhere else. We're all thinking about who else can do something, but not actually doing it ourselves. And then the thing was, when someone does it, because it was an actual experiment, like when someone does something, it's more likely for other people to do it. So we just need someone or a group of people to actually take the lead for other people to follow.
Wow. I guess she stole your thunder, Ian.
No, not at all. I love listening to younger people because I have a lot of hope. It just, to me, it's the better way to be. Because if you look at certain things, like say the climate, there's a lot of scientists and others who despair about that, right? But not getting into any of that, I think, to me, with what people have said tonight, like, part of the issue I feel is like there there needs to be a radical shift. And now I'll talk about it from an Indigenous perspective, right? Um, and to use your herd metaphor that you were talking about earlier, a wise woman once told me, she said that we used to all be bison and we lived in our communities and on the land. And whenever a storm would come on the prairie, bison herds would turn and head towards it because they knew their best chance for survival would be to go into the storm. When bison run out of water, they'll go to certain spots and they'll dig with their hoof until they find water. The problem is we've all become cattle. We've all become cows. So when cattle are in herds on the prairie and a storm comes, they turn and walk away from it. And they keep going until they hit a fence. And sometimes with the storm, a flood will come and they'll all drown. If cattle don't have water, they die. They need to have a dugout. They need to find water somehow, but they don't have that ability anymore. So the message behind this was that we're moving away from who we were as human beings in a communal situation, and we're becoming more homogenous, right? So that we're all kind of doing the same thing, which is kind of not doing anything. We're being a bit performative, you know. But I guess the other part of this is, my friend once said to me, he says, as Indigenous people, we kind of have two paths we can take. He said, we can be woodpeckers so that we have the structures that exist and we're on the outside tapping at that tree. Doesn't make a lot of change, makes a lot of noise, but doesn't make a lot of change. Or we can be termites. They also work within the wood, but they work inside of it, right? I study history a little bit, and I use the example of the development of Black theater in the United States in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s. And there were kind of two deliberate approaches. One was Black artists, theater artists said, we're going to create our own theater spaces. We're going to make our own theaters. This is how we tell our stories. This is how we express who we are, et cetera, et cetera. The other group said, well, no, we need to work within, be the termites, if you will, the existing structures of theater and those theater companies, and that's how we need to make change. So looking at it like 30 years later, most of those Black companies disappeared. They kind of failed out because that often happens when you have a strong personality, and when that personality leaves, the company kind of dissolves. But what happened was those Black artists who worked within the existing structure changed those structures so that, surprise, surprise, they were programming plays written by more people of color, more women. And so that was affecting change. And why I tell that story is because I call it the Polo Park problem. So Polo Park is the biggest mall in Winnipeg. And let's say there's 200 stores in Winnipeg, okay, or in Polo Park. And in terms of demographics, so Winnipeg has the largest urban Indigenous population probably in the world. Like, there are more Indigenous people in Winnipeg than I would guess just about any other city in the whole world, right? Population of Manitoba is about maybe 18%. There's estimates that'll go to 25% within like 10 years of the population of Manitoba is Indigenous. So we look at those 200 stores in Polo Park, and I'm just making that number up, and we take all the staff out and we leave just one staff member in each of those stores. And we as a group all go walking around. How many Indigenous employees do you think we'll find? Do you think we'll find, if there's about 18%, we should find 36 of those stores should have an Indigenous person in them? I can bet you money you're not going to find that. And that to me is indicative of a huge problem where Indigenous people are not, we're not being included. And part of it is not, I'm not going to just say it's the other's fault. It's part of what's happened to us as well. You know, growing up with oppression and exclusion, you kind of give up at some point too. And you kind of go, why am I even going to bother? If I go put my resume in there, they're not going to hire me. And that might be true, it might not be, right? But that to me is really, that worries me, because that's something that I think we all need to find a way to change that, right? And part of it is recognizing that historic oppression. This will be the last little story I tell, right? I often ask people, I say, if you look at all the corporations in Canada, what percentage do you think are run by women? And people will say 5%, 10%. They always go low, which is in itself indicative. The answer is it's around 18%. So all the corporations in Canada, about 18% are run by women. Demographically, women are about 53% of the population. So that number shouldn't be 18, it should be more like 50, right? But why is it? Why aren't there more women as the head of like CEOs of companies in Canada, right? And the answer is simple. It's because women are lazy. Women just want to be on welfare. They just want to have babies. Like all of these things that are said about Indigenous people, and that's okay. But when you say it in this context, and it's not true, I'm just using it as an example, people say, well, no, it's because women have been oppressed. They didn't have the right to vote until a certain time. Within my lifetime, women couldn't get a bank account without their husband, and I'm not that old. Like, so people readily acknowledge that there's been historic oppression of women. Like it was just the Women's Day yesterday, right? Like that is acknowledged. But when it comes to us, it's what Kate was saying. It's like, you know, just pull yourself up by the bootstrap. My folks came here with $20 in their pockets. And it's like, yeah, and were your folks taken and put into schools? Or sorry, you yourself, like were you then raised by parents who didn't have parents? Like, so there's this disconnect that we need to connect to, but it's not happening because it's so difficult. And as much as Canadians like to think of themselves as like really cool, wonderful people, when it comes to this issue, I find it gets a little bit uncomfortable. So.
Wow, lots to think about. Hani, I told you Ian is a master of storyteller.
Oh, I thought Kate is next, so I don't know.
Oh,
I was.
I'm
Yeah.
just jumping around now.
Yeah. Okay, no problem. Yeah. So I really do. Do you want to form a question, or you want me just to kind of jump at any part? Or?
Jump in at any part if you want to ask Ian a question, Darasimi. I mean, there's so much to kind of take in.
So I am like when it comes to these kind of conversations, I think one would have to be very like fair in terms of in terms of my participation in conversation like this. When it comes to Indigenous related matters or subject, I intend to not to speak about it. And the reason is, if there's an Indigenous person speaking about it, they're speaking about it. I find it very difficult to compare the Indigenous, for example, struggle or whatever the case may be associated with the history with us as newcomers. I intend not to do that. Why? Because they are both very uniquely different, very different. And it's when we start mixing things up, it gets a little kind of messy, and also is not objective. And every point, obviously, if we dig deeper, we'll find different answers. And so whether it's related to human rights, women rights, has been mentioned, or others, I think there are many different ways to discuss the very same issue. But because we're talking about tokenism, which is I'm trying to fit it. I don't know in which context, but tokenism as a concept is very interesting concept, and so we're trying to approach this concept to find out what we're trying to do with it. Are we trying to define it? We're trying to fit it into our social setting. Are we trying to use it in our work setting? What are we trying to do with tokenism? Again, I think the Canadian example is different from the globe. It happened to be I've been to probably 26 countries in the world, and I can tell you this: like, I intend to slow down before I delve into any subject, and the reason for it is, again, there's local perspective or local context, and there's a global one. The global one drags you to different places and may not allow you to be too fast in terms of judgment to the local one. And now again, I'm excluding the indigenous side of it. I'm not talking about the indigenous, but I'm talking about us, newcomers. Before we criticize and I intend to say, before we criticize, before we trying to advocate for a specific group, we need to keep in mind that are we segregating or are we promoting justice for all in terms of regardless of demographics, or is it important to identify each demographic group separately for the sake of tokenism? Because it is important here that tokenism, you can't just apply it to every setting. It just doesn't work. And I think, for us as newcomers, I would challenge every newcomer that said they would say they are being mistreated here in Canada, and they were treated really well in their own country, their home countries. I will have a very long conversation with them. They will have the right, and they probably would have the right to discuss it according to their perspective, but they need to prepare themselves for a very lengthy conversation, because you have to be objective. When you complain about something, you have to know why you're complaining. Are you complaining because you're comparing to what? Again, local or global? Wow. And so that, I think it's, I'm struggling with the concept of tokenism. Are we talking about tokenism just in general, or are we talking about in a specific setting, specific aspect of life, in like specific part of the system? Is it past, present? Depends really, because it's a huge concept. So I really don't know where to fit it. But other than that, I can say it's really as a good reminder for all of us, the newcomers. I'm speaking to the newcomers, and the newcomers, people who are foreign born, including Kate, by the way. Right, Kate? You're born in the United States. So that's all the newcomers. They probably, when we talk, we would talk and say, ask ourselves, are we focusing on advocating for the people who are like us? And is that in a bubble or part of a society? Are we trying to join the society, the host society, or are we trying to create our own bubble? Again, segregation. Now we're creating tokenism without us knowing, because we're trying to promote inclusivity, right? So inclusivity to whom? To everyone, or just us? And based on what? Common factors or what? Like so it can take us to different places, but all what I'm saying, I remind myself to be objective. I mention the things, the difficulties, and then I would say, do I attribute those difficulties and hardships to the society, to a specific individual, or to me? or maybe it's elements of everything that I mentioned. And so it can go different places, but again, being objective and fair, I think, is the key in terms of discussing tokenism in everywhere, uh, in every setting, in every part of our lives. And speaking of newcomers and their life here, you would say you can see many good positive aspects of us living here in this country than the negative part. And of course, there are groups within the groups. And I cannot speak on behalf of every newcomer because every group is unique. But nevertheless, I think objective conversation needs to be directed and guided by kind of a sense of fairness to us to what we want to achieve and which part of what part of this tokenism we want to tackle. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Kate, question. Can we just get rid of the word tokenism? Like, let's just scrap it. Let's just everybody's
I don't
equal.
think we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Let's
yeah,
put on
I
our
don't think-
bison heads and let's like put our hooves into the ground and dig for water.
You know, I think it's a valid word, and I think we actually have to kind of continue to recognize it, because it's too easy. It's too easy to, as I said, you know, look for the box and check it and say I've done my due diligence, sort of thing. So first of all, I only wanted to, because what I didn't say first with Darasami to begin with, I love the fact that you guys kind of came together to debate something, and there was a misunderstanding, and you both kind of developed the same arguments, right? And of course, what I found is, like you said, yeah, we worked it out, you know, like that was fine, you know. And so, because of course, like the whole part of debate, right, is like when you're preparing for a debate, you're supposed to understand what you think the other side is going to say to you, right? You're supposed to examine those arguments, and you're supposed to have a rebuttal. But that's the idea. We always listen to respond. We don't actually listen to hear, you know, or at least certainly in my culture, that's the problem. And I don't want to put that on every other culture, because I actually think many other cultures do it way better than mine, is they actually listen to hear what the other person is saying. And that's the basis of conversation. So I love the fact that you got together to have a confrontational debate, but then you figured it out so that how you could do that. The other thing, when you asked me the question about, like, can we get rid of tokenism, but then listening to Ian and talking about demographics, because demographics is a very tricky thing. When we talk about the idea that, again, so in Canada, we know 4% of the overall population are Indigenous, but they represent about 25 to 28% of the incarcerated population. Some people will take away a racist view of that demographic. They're, you know, just as Ian said, women just want to stay home and have babies, and they don't want to go to work and that sort of thing. So the idea, like, I very much, and when we look at the overrepresentation of people with diabetes and Indigenous people will go, well, that's a lifestyle choice. It's like, no, like, once you put them all together, you have to say it's structural racism. That is what is at the root of it. And so when you ask me the question, can we get rid of tokenism, or at least the word? No, we have to get rid of tokenism for yes, but we can't get rid of defining it when we see it, because that is a huge part of the problem. And not being afraid of the numbers, because just, you know, obviously we're still not out of a pandemic, and we actually struggle in Social Planning Council with Immigration Partnership Winnipeg, when we were identifying who was transmitting, where were the hotspots of transmission. And of course, a lot of them were in places where people of newcomer were working, in places. Well, guess what? Those are the only opportunities they were afforded. Their working conditions did not allow them to say, no, I am not doing that. It's an unsafe place for me to work. You know, that's the idea. Is like, they were low wage, they had no sick pay, no sick leave, none of those things. That's why those were hotspots for the spread of COVID-19. So the problem is some people will always look at it and try to blame the individual, but it's up to us to make sure that we actually say why why this happened, and it's about the structures around that caused it to happen.
No doubt, yes. COVID-19, I think, really showed a lot of things, right, to all of us, and human nature and everything else altogether. Darasimi, I'm going to give you the last word. Words of wisdom from this young lady on tokenism or anything. I know that you also like to talk about racism too. We've covered a little bit about that too as well. Diversity. What would you like to see done as a number one action that we can take away tonight?
I'd like for like the older generation and the new generation to kind of like meet in the middle, because a lot of the newer generations, they claim to understand like what the older generations have gone through, but they're not actually trying to understand. They're just, like you said, listening to respond. Because for things like history repeating, we need to learn about history for it not to repeat, or else it's going to repeat. So we need to make sure that we educate ourselves. And for people that have these negative experiences, you don't have to be vulnerable when you don't want to, but kind of like share experiences in case someone might be going through the same thing.
All right. Well, thank you. We're all nodding. And you get my vote there, see me when you run for for government, okay? They'll be our first female, whatever. But thank you so much for joining us, and all the best to you in grade 11. And continue on this course. We're all here behind you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Ian. And thank you, Kate and Hani, for this incredible conversation. And to all of you out there, take some action. Tokenism, what does it mean? And let's do something about it. All right, thank you so much for joining us tonight on Healing Hearts. Good night.